Hey everybody, let's talk about genetics. So the previous lab we talked about cell division, mitosis, right? And so what were we actually doing in that lab? Well, in that lab we were actually observing and looking at genetic material or DNA in the form of chromosomes, right? So we had those cells, and in the nucleus you've got all that chromatin. But then what happens is it starts to organize, right, throughout interphase. Things grow, things develop. The genetic material doubles, and then it eventually condenses, and then you go through prophase. Now you have the discrete chromosomes, right? Nuclear envelope breaks down. Remember PMAT, metaphase now. Those sister chromatids are lined up in the middle, right? The spindle is attached to them. Oh, whoops. There's our cell again. And then we have anaphase, where the spindle starts to contract. They're pulled apart. And then finally, telophase or telophase. You have your chromosomes that start to decondense. You reform of your nuclear envelope. And then ultimately, what happens? Cell membrane, cytokinesis, everything goes back. And you end up with two cells, right? So that was cell division. That was mitosis. So what does that have to do with genetics? Well, it has a lot to do with genetics. But let's take a second and think about this. So what we've basically just been thinking about and observing in the previous lab was DNA, the genetic material itself. So my question to you is I want you to think about which one of these came first as far as human understanding or questioning. Did we know about DNA before we knew about genetics? Or did we know about genetics before we knew about DNA? So think about that for a second. Which one came first? So if you said DNA, it's a really good idea because most modern genetics have a foundation in DNA. Just about everything we do now with things you hear in the news like CRISPR and gene editing and stuff like that comes from a fundamental understanding of DNA and its structure, the double helix and the base pairing ACTG and sequence stuff, and even extra stuff around the genetics, above the genetics, epigenetics, and so on. But actually, we've been thinking about genetics for much, much, much longer. DNA we've only really known the structure in the mid 20th century, the 1950s. Before then, people thought proteins were actually what conveyed all these traits and things like that. But genetics, people have been thinking about and making observations and comments on and thinking about and studying for far, far longer. That doesn't mean DNA is not important, but the study and thinking about genetics is much older. Well, so how? Well, how does that work? If we didn't know about DNA, how do we think about genetics? Well, think about that video that I posted about me looking at the park and some observations you can make. And you can put yourself in that position. And you don't have to look at animals. You can look at people. And so what is it that people notice? Well, it's all about heredity. It's all about heredity, or the passing of traits. So we're talking about traits. The passing of these traits downwards from parents to children, to grandchildren, and so on and so forth, right? The passing of traits, this heredity, or another way of talking about it is the inheritance of traits. That is what people have been paying attention to and noticing about genetics for a long time. Well, what have they been noticing? Well, they notice that an offspring strongly resembles their parents. And you can observe this. And not just with people, not just with, like, say, traits like hair color, eye color, things like that, but you can see this in animals. If you have an animal with really long horns, right? Let's say it's like a bull. I'm not going to try to draw a bull. That would be terrible. And it seems like their offspring typically have long horns, especially if you have two parents that are both long-horned. It seems like these traits certainly follow suit. And these type of observations were really cataloged by a monk named Gregor Mendel, and you hear about Mendelian genetics and inheritance, stuff like that. He did experiments with pea plants and things like that, and looking at the quality of the leaves and the flowers and things like that. So for many, many, many years, genetics has been a very, very important thing that people have thought about, because they have these traits that they want, these qualities that they want, and just understanding things. So that is what we're talking about for this lab, and understanding what genetics do and how it all works. We're not going to get into the depth of it. We're not going to do any of those crosses that maybe you've done in previous classes, where you do these trait crosses called Punnett squares, where you have like traits like this. We're not going to do any of that stuff. But it's kind of the understanding of how these traits work is what we're really going to focus on.